So we begin by acknowledging with respect we gather today in Lenape-Hoking, the traditional homeland of the Lenape people for tens of thousands of years. Sometimes translated as original people, the Lenape were known as mediators and called the grandfathers by the entire Algonquin family tree of languages. Within the first 100 years of foreign contact, 80% of the Lenape had already died from violent conflict and disease. But some Lenape never left. Hiding in plain sight as keepers of the land, the Lenape Indian tribe of Delaware, based in Cheswold, Delaware, the Nanacoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation in Bridgeton, New Jersey, and the Ramapo Lenape Nation in Mahwah, New Jersey, are three of the thriving Lenape communities today. Let us acknowledge the historical and ongoing presence of the Lenape and the Nanacoke on this land where we now live, work, and celebrate all our relations. So thank you, and I will now pass it to Dr. Melva Ware to talk a bit more about History Makers Award and to introduce our moderator for this program.
Good evening. I am Melva Ware, former trustee of the Delaware Historical Society and continuing member of the Mitchell Center Advisory Group. And I also co-chair this year the History Makers Awards Program Steering Committee. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event. Also, we have a very timely conversation planned, Realities from the Frontlines, and it will be recorded and added to the Historical Society's personal accounts of Delawareans' experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have a distinguished panel of healthcare professionals led by Dr. Velma Scantlebury-White, the nation's first African-American woman to specialize in transplant surgery. Dr. Scantlebury-White, I'm delighted to announce, will receive the Delaware Historical Society's History Makers Award on October 7th, 2021. The award pays tribute to individuals who've made a positive and lasting contribution to our state, the nation, or the world. Consider this your very first invitation to join us for the October 7th celebration. You want to get your tickets early. You don't want to miss the party. Now, let's get to this important conversation. I am pleased to present, because she needs no introduction, our very own Nichelle Polston, a talented journalist and very committed community ally working for all the right causes. She's active in leadership roles with the ACLU, Christina Cultural Arts Center, 100, the Coalition of 100 Black Women, and many, many more. Nichelle will introduce our panel and moderate the conversation. Welcome all. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you in October. It's on you, Nichelle.
You're on mute.
So sorry about that. I was still on mute. But thank you so much, Dr. Ware. I'm very happy and very excited to be here. And as you mentioned earlier, we are here to discuss COVID. Just about a year ago, many of us, our lives were shaken up a bit. We were quarantined. We had to learn about this new rule called social distancing and a number of different things. And so we want to revisit COVID from a year ago. And before we introduce the panelists and even our wonderful special guest, Dr. Velma Scantlebury, I would love to look at a video that sort of gives us this chance to relive when the news hit about COVID-19. Can we play the video?
All right, we have breaking news now. Let's get to it. It has to do with COVID-19. And the World Health Organization has just declared a global coronavirus. It is a pandemic at this point. Let's talk about what that means. The criteria of a pandemic describes the worldwide spread of a new disease, involves a new virus against which most people do not yet have any immunity. Virus can infect people easily and spreads person to person. We are seeing those things. It implies efforts to contain an outbreak in a region or country have failed. A pandemic describes how widespread an illness is, not how necessarily lethal it is. The WHO has said it is tightening its criteria for classifying an outbreak as a pandemic and is working on a new definition as it relates to coronavirus.
So as we got a chance to see the coronavirus, we were finally learning bits and pieces throughout the months of March and April. And Dr. Scantlebury, before I even go to her, she has been committed to educating and raising awareness about COVID-19. Some of us still not aware of everything that goes into even the vaccinations, and getting to hear from people on the front lines is something that we don't often get to do and get to hear. But I want to remind folks, even though Dr. Ware mentioned that Dr. Scantlebury is the first African-American female transplant surgeon in the United States, I might add, and we have her here in Delaware. She recently retired from Christiana Care and is currently a professor of surgery at Texas Christian University and medical school. And she's just really involved in community education, so much so that she wants all of you who are watching this evening to really get engaged. So do not be afraid to type in a question. If you have a question, please. I know we are still probably suffering from Zoom fatigue at this point, but please type in your questions. Consider this a family environment where we get to openly discuss a number of things, and no question is too dumb. So with that said, I would love to take this moment and just to make it a little fun, show some hand claps in the chat while we welcome Dr. Velma Scantlebury.
Thank you, Nichelle. Thank you so much. I am excited to be here, and this is a great opportunity for us to chronicle what happened in 2020. And we will always remember 2020 as the pandemic year, the year of COVID-19, where we all got quarantined to our homes. We were locked down. We had to pull our kids out of school. We had to work from home, and we learned how to adjust. But while some of us were working from home, we know that healthcare workers were asked to do double duty, abandoning their families and trying to fight the fight of our community as this COVID took the lives of all those that we knew, patients, colleagues, and even our loved ones. So tonight we'll hear a little bit about our own frontline workers here in Delaware and their own personal stories. We'll get a glimpse at what it was like working in the battle zone and talk about their firsthand experiences as we unmask the health disparities that the pandemic brought front and center. So how did we all get started? We know that back in beginning of 2020, we heard about this SARS-CoV infection, but we knew later on that it was December of 2019 that there was a cluster of pneumonias reported in the seafood market in Wuhan. And on January 7th, 2020, we confirmed that this was associated with a new virus, which was at that time called 2019 novel coronavirus. And unfortunately, we jumped to the fact that it was by January 30th of 2020 that we reported nearly 1,000 cases across 21 countries. And our first case here in the United States was on January 19th, when a 35-year-old man presented in Washington State with a history of cough and fever, turning out that he had visited China, Wuhan, and contracted the virus. And so we were then unfortunate, World Health World Health Organization declared a global health emergency on January 30th, due to the thousands of people that were reported to have contracted this new virus. So that is how it all got started. And we know that, there's much more to come.
May I insert a question? We had conversations offline, and while it's important to talk about how it got started, many people were hearing it for the first time come March 2020. Any reason why, since you mentioned early on in December of 2019, that's when the stories started to circulate?
Well, unfortunately, I think many people were not paying attention to the fact that there were cases being reported in Washington State. And while we are removed from that area of the country, we were just it was sort of played down both by our leaders of this country, and we weren't focusing on the World Health Organization thought perhaps we'll declare an emergency. Travel was banned from China to the United States. But unfortunately, just around that time, I remember it was trying to think, it was January 27th, when Kobe Bryant passed away, and an unfortunate death. And so the whole country was centered around the death of Kobe Bryant. And so a whole week, 10 days went by before there was really any focus on this COVID-19 virus, which actually was named COVID-19 by the World Health Organization to really stand for coronavirus pandemic, coronavirus of 2019, because that's how it started. And so our national leaders were saying it will all go away, don't worry about it, and so it was played down. And it was not until the World Health Organization decided that this was something that we needed to pay attention to, and we went into much more aggressive documentation. And we ended up with our first case here in Delaware. I think it was early March.
And that first case happened, from what I understand or what I remember, the University of Delaware.
Correct. That was a University of Delaware associate who was tested positive, and that led to the shutdown of the university. Our governor stepped in, and Governor Carney decided that we would be cautious. And so from there on, it was the first case in Newcastle County for here in Delaware, and that set the ball rolling as we then went to a total shutdown by March.
Is this related to SARS at all?
Yes, SARS-CoV, SARS-CoV-19 was the second name of it, and then that's the name of the original virus, which was then coined the term COVID-19 is really a term signifying the disease that's caused by this coronavirus of 2019. So the virus is SARS-CoV-19, the disease SARS-CoV-2, and the disease is COVID-19 disease, that's coined by an acronym by the World Health Organization to officially name the disease caused by the virus.
Now, I probably shouldn't bring this up, but I really feel the need to all of a sudden. There are and have been, I don't want to say news reports, but we've heard via social media. And even though you gave us all of the scientific terms, but what about this, the 5G? Have you heard stories of, you get COVID-19 from 5G cellular towers? What would you like to say to folks who really have it in their heads that that's how it started?
There is so much misinformation out there. Unfortunately, we knew that this virus came from China. There's a lot of misinformation and controversy over how it started, whether it was in the seafood market or whether someone was through contact, a transmission from someone else. it got to the United States. That's the reality. It didn't just get to the United States, it got to many countries. Early on, within January 30th, it was already in 21 countries. That's how many people were traveling outside of China, just taking this disease with them. And it came to the United States. Had nothing to do with 5G. And it wasn't just, I know initially we were saying it didn't attack Black and brown people, but by the time it got to the east, the middle, and the east coast of the United States, we began to realize that by April 15th, many of the reports showed that those who being affected in terms of COVID-19 was about 30% of those were people of African American descent, and so COVID did not discriminate by age or by race. Initially, we felt it was just the elderly, so the young people felt there didn't need to be protected and wear masks, and then we found out that it wasn't just the elderly. So COVID did not discriminate at all.
And let's talk a little bit about that before I even go into the wonderful panelists that we have. The COVID-19 cases by race. Can you touch on that a bit more?
Yes, we know that unfortunately that people of color were at increased risk for illness if contracted COVID-19 due to the higher rates of underlying health conditions such as asthma, high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity compared to the white population. They were more likely to be uninsured and lacked the ability to really find those services for testing. And one of the things that we saw early on were the barriers to getting a COVID test. You had to have insurance, you had to have a prescription, you had to be able to get to a center that was either had by appointment. And so that was very definitely had disparities for those people of ethnic backgrounds who didn't have the ability to have a prescription or to make that appointment. And we know that unfortunately we have in the Black and brown communities, we have multi-generational families. So, and those who work on the front lines, who had to go to work despite the lockdown, who had to still be out there cleaning the hospitals, who still had to drive the buses and pick up the garbage. All those things were jobs that still needed to be done. And those folks still got exposed. And there where we began to see the disparities in the Black and brown people getting sicker and dying and more hospitalizations when it came to COVID-19. And we know that African Americans make up 30% of the population, but more than 30% of COVID cases were related to Black and brown people. In Washington, DC, 59% of those were African Americans. In Louisiana, 70% of those hospitalized were African Americans. And so it's important to understand that this disease really ravaged disproportionately the Black and Latino communities.
Thank you for giving us all that information, because now I think this is a great opportunity to talk to some of the panelists that we have here. And I want to start off with Dr. Brian Perry. Dr. Perry is a double-boarded emergency and internal medicine physician practicing in a large hospital system in Kent County. He is from Florida, the Sunshine State, where he attended Florida A&M University for undergrad. He then went to Georgetown University for medical school and completed the dual emergency and internal medicine residency program at Christiana Health Care System. He splits his time between being at hospitals and an emergency medicine physician, and was clinically active during the COVID-19 pandemic throughout the state of Delaware. Next up, and if you can just wave Dr. Perry, since we have two men on the panel for this evening. Next, I'd like to introduce Kathy Crawford. She is a RN here in the state, and she graduated from the University of Delaware in 1991, and have been a critical care nurse for 30 years. We applaud you for your service, Kathy, we really do. And she has worked in a variety of critical care units as well. She is also an adjunct faculty for several local universities, teaching clinical to nursing students. And for the past 14 months, she has worked in a COVID ICU here in Delaware. And last but not least, and I do not like to do this, but I want to have James, please, James, tell me your last name. Pronounce it for me.
Ndungu.
One more.
James Ndungu.
Ndungu. Okay. James Ndungu worked as a dialysis nurse in acute settings for the last 3 years. His employer is a big organization or company that is in kidney care, and he covers 3 hospitals, namely one that he doesn't want to name it, but it's in Elkton, Maryland. He also works in one in Pennsylvania and another in Wilmington. He is married and a father of 2. So I want to start with Dr. Brian Perry. You mentioned in your bio that you are an ER doctor and worked the internal in the ICU, basically. And so tell us about the flow of the emergency room when COVID hit last year.
Yeah, so we initially heard about COVID in January, February, and initially it turned out to be this. It was kind of remote, but I think things started getting real when we started seeing what was happening with the Italians, and I think that kind of made everybody kind of panic a little bit. But the Italians also gave us a kind of a playbook of what to expect. And, they said, expect early on that a lot of elderly people will start coming in. They told us to expect, them to come in waves, more so in the afternoon. They told us to expect to lose have about 10% of our own staff get sick. Just the news reporting on what was happening in Italy kind of really made us all pay attention. As far as, the question about how things flowed in the ER, we actually witnessed something that was a little bit different, something that I didn't expect. So the actual volumes started going down as people became more afraid to come to the ER because of the pandemic and being exposed to COVID. And so we started seeing a lot less of the acuity, the lower acuity. I twisted my ankle. And then so the patient volume went down, but the acuity started going up. And it got to a point where we had to, our particular hospital works in 4 pods. And we had to kind of switch and make one pod a COVID pod and try to cohort people who have, normal medical emergencies as well, like heart attacks, strokes. And, the weird part is that COVID kind of ties into all those emergencies too, as well. So we were seeing a lot of patients who came in with, heart attacks and ended up testing positive for COVID. A lot of the things that the Italians did say came to pass. We did see a lot of elderly. We did see, there's explosion from nursing homes, and also in particularly the Purdue chicken company. Because of their working conditions, they have a lot of people who are in close quarters, and so that became a risk factor for having COVID in itself. I remember.
I do have a question. Because you're mentioning all these things. What about patients who are asymptomatic? Did you find a lot of those patients coming in?
Well, patients coming in for other chief complaints, like I stumped my toe,
Okay.
and then, have a little cough, and ended up turning out to be positive. Or, we definitely saw patients who, came in for other reasons and were found to have COVID, under subsequent testing. But yeah.
One of the things that I love that the Delaware Historical Society is doing is it's important to the organization to collect personal COVID stories. And so I'm thankful that you're sharing some of the experiences that you've had last year, but what was it like for you personally in the emergency room, all these people coming in and pretty much with the symptoms that you heard in Italy?
Yes. So my initial response to the whole pandemic, was fear. I had a very healthy fear of this disease. I didn't know what it would do to me. I didn't know how I would, fare out and, help other people as well. I had nightmares about just being in a situation where I couldn't get to people and people were just, ill, and I couldn't help. And so that fear turned into kind of an obsession with reading. It kind of turned into an obsession with PPE and making sure I'm fully, I'm doing everything that I possibly can to make sure I do not contract this disease, this virus. And I worked. I worked very, very hard in 2020. I remember days just feeling so run down and exhausted and not even wanting to sleep in the call room because I wanted to get out of the hospital and just being tired driving home.
Explain your routine when some people adopted a routine or a daily habit of taking off and removing all of their clothes when they would arrive at home and just maybe leaving them in your foyer or vestibule. Was that something that you found yourself doing?
Well, I was blessed in the sense that, I live alone. And so, my family's down in Florida. So, I definitely would just come home and, I was washing my clothes every day. My electricity bill definitely went up the water bill and the electricity bill, went up over the time. I think that the real routine was more so getting ready to work, to go to work was legit like getting ready to go to a war. It's like you're putting on this armor and this mask and these goggles and these hats and I would see people, my colleagues who did everything right and still somehow contracted the virus. And so it was every day was fear, it was anxiety, it was trepidation, it was fear of the unknown. And chronically, that I'm a happy person. I'm generally a happy person. But you'll be surprised at how over time, it kind of chips away at your state of mind and your well-being. But knock on wood, thank God we made it to vaccination. And I do think that there was at least something. There was a point in time where we didn't know what was going on. But then there was another point where we had something to hope for, which was the vaccine. And I was just praying that I could just hold out. I was checking the numbers every day, see what was going on in Delaware, where the hot spots were, where the trends were. Surprisingly, in Delaware, what ended up happening was, so it initially kind of trickled down so New York was the epicenter. It trickled down, from, New Jersey down to Philadelphia and kind of from the northern Delaware down. But also a lot of people in New York have homes down in southern Delaware. So I couldn't understand why southern Delaware was exploding just as much as northern Delaware was. But that was, just we work at another hospital. I do 2 hospitals down in our health system, which is one of them is in, a little bit southern Delaware. And there are way more cases down there than the main hospital that I currently work at.
So you mentioned it was like a war. You've seen, or I guess, had the opportunity to treat a number of different patients, a variety of Black, white, Asian, a number, right?
Absolutely.
Is that safe to say? And so you described it as getting ready for war. I want to take this moment to go to the nurses, Kathy and James, because one of the things that really hit home for me is family members who were not allowed in a hospital to see their loved ones as they fought COVID-19. And so, Kathy, if you can share with us, there was this inability to visit loved ones, and many people died alone, and the only people they got a chance to see on a day-to-day were the doctors and nurses. Can you speak to that?
Yes, I certainly can. I took care of, I would say, dozens and dozens of patients that died alone in my ICU. It was very morally distressing. I think you had mentioned I have been a nurse for 30 years, so I have developed some tough skin, I think, and kind of been able to shut it off. And this was my first time in my career where I just couldn't turn it off. I think we saw everything on the news with social media, and everybody was talking about COVID-19, and then we went to work and we had to deal with, like you said, that reality of people dying alone. We had iPads in our ICU rooms, and we would FaceTime the families. And I have certainly taken care of patients who have died before, and they've had families at the bedside. And usually I step out of the room and allow the families and the patient to have some privacy while keeping them comfortable. But this was the first time I was with the patients and the family in their very intimate moments of saying goodbye. It was not uncommon to have a spouse and children and 15 grandkids on these FaceTime calls, all saying goodbye to their loved ones. And I'm, as Brian mentioned, I'm wearing a mask and a hat and a shield and a gown and gloves. And it felt, it was really just awful. I can't really think of, it's really hard to put into words how hard it was for us. And it wasn't uncommon in my unit at any given, I worked 12-hour night shifts, and it wasn't uncommon to have at least one or two nurses crying in a corner at least every shift. And, you kind of had to let it out, cry, get it together. The room got cleaned and up came the next COVID patient, and you had to do it all over again.
So you found yourself filling in the gaps pretty much a lot over the last year.
Yes.
I want to have you speak about some of the fear. Dr. Perry mentioned that he was worried. He even began to obsess and started to read a lot about this COVID-19. And so talk about the fear of getting even infected yourself. You're in the war zone, for lack of better words. And,
right.
and I don't want to spoil it, but you actually had COVID and brought it home to your families.
I did. So I think Brian said it very well. The first thing was fear and anxiety. When I watched that clip that you started at the beginning of this talk, my heart started to race a little bit, and here it is a year later, and I could feel the anxiety. And I had the same kind of ritual that Brian or Dr. Perry mentioned about making sure that I had all my PPE on correctly. We would often check each other to make sure. I actually had my husband and family separated from me in the house. I have 4 daughters and my husband, and we didn't sleep in the same bed for several months, starting in March, because I was so afraid of bringing it home to my family. And I actually did contract COVID in May of last year from a patient. And that was my worst fear, that I would take it home to my family. And my husband became ill, and one of my daughters did as well. And
I want to give Nurse James an opportunity to share too, but thank you so much, Kathy. I'm glad you look good. So I'm glad you're feeling better and that you survived and you were able to come out of it, as well as your family members. may I have James, Nurse James, talk about how you felt. I'm sure you felt the same fear.
Yeah, thank you, Nichelle, for your question. Yeah, it was very, very distressing, especially when you see a patient dying in front of people they don't know, strangers. And these strangers, they are all gowned up with gowns. You can't see their faces, you can't see their facial expression. It was very, very painful. And uh, that's a very bad experience I would not like to go through again. But thank God we have a cure now. We have this vaccine. It came to save us and save the community. And I've been urging my friends who have been reluctant to take the vaccine to go ahead and take the vaccine. I was among the first to take the vaccine when it was offered in one of the hospitals that I work in. So I can say it wasn't that easy. And another thing that still lingers in my mind is when I was seeing those patients trying to gasp for air, trying to breathe, they couldn't breathe. It made me feel so bad, and to an extent of even shedding a tear. So it wasn't a good sight.
I do have a question from the audience, and either Dr. Perry, Nurse Kathy, or Nurse James, please feel free to jump in. And this question is, are there any health benefits to taking vitamin A or vitamin D to fight COVID-19? And anyone can answer the question. I know one of the things that I would take all the time was zinc. I don't know if it helped, but I would do garlic and zinc. But what about vitamin A and vitamin D?
Well, I think there are more robust studies regarding vitamin D for sure, with COVID-19, and of course our knowledge is only as good as the science behind it and the studies. And so I will say that this was a very remarkable disease, or a remarkable time to see the scientific community in action. But to answer your question, vitamin D plays a very important role in immune health. And they did some studies where they kind of looked at people with who had higher levels of vitamin D. They looked at studies where patients were given vitamin D before getting COVID. They looked at vitamin D as a treatment. And anything that kind of boosts the immune system, I think is good. But I was taking vitamin D, I was taking calcium, zinc, magnesium. Haven't heard too much about vitamin A in particular, but I am definitely, after looking at the literature, I definitely that's something that I take every day. I still take vitamin D to this day. I actually, believe it or not, got a cold, last week, and took some vitamin D and ended up getting better a lot faster. And so, but yeah, so I hope that answers the question.
Another question from the audience, and feel free to answer this, and Nurse Kathy and James as well. Someone wants to know if the fear impacted your work, the fear of getting COVID.
Oh yes, it definitely impacted me for sure, because typically I'm a friendly, hands-on, I'm definitely one of the physicians where I like to look at you in the eye and talk to you face to face, and establish rapport, establish that human connection. But with COVID, my practice was to I would interview a patient with someone who I suspected to have COVID. I would talk to the patient from kind of outside of the room, kind of get some of the history from them. And it was a little weird having to do that at 8 to 10 feet away, but only go in the room to, I would go into the room to examine them. and kind of step out to limit, my exposure, which is also why I want to really, really, truly take my hat off and salute a lot of the nurses, Kathy, everybody, because, they had the most time in the room with the patients. They had, they were doing things at bedside. From an ER doc standpoint, I go from room to room and see patient to patient, and kind of, my job is to kind of treat acutely, stabilize, and move to the next, mindful about flow. But it's the nurses that are really truly taking care of the patients and executing plans, and doing spending the time with people and with the patients as well. But that was me. I was definitely fearful.
Do you think you'll go back to that now that the vaccination is out and you see yourself going back to
I'm
your
way
old
more
self?
friendly. Well, I hope not. I hope not. Of course, I keep my ear toward the news. Of course, what's going on in India at this time right now. The biggest concern is that the virus discovers this escape mutation and can kind of bypass the vaccine, and then we're looking at COVID-19 all over again. And so, but I hope not. I think things are a lot more relaxed now. I've had a lot more time to learn about the disease. I have a lot more confidence with the science and with the being vaccinated, and I'm a lot more comfortable now. We've been, we're a year and some change in now, and so it was a scary time. But I think the good news is that we can kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel at this time.
Thank you so much. Nurse Kathy,
Yes.
since you actually contracted COVID, has it impacted your work after 30 years? Do you see yourself having a difficulty on a job at times?
No, not having difficulty doing my job. And like Brian said, I would be in these rooms with these patients sometimes for upwards of 2 hours at a time with the mask and the hat and the gown and the gloves. It didn't impact my ability to do my job, but I think I can speak for a lot of nurses, it impacted mentally, the place that we are now. It was very morally distressing to do what we did, to watch all of these patients die. I went probably 7 or 8 months where I didn't have a patient survive. And that can take a toll that I think we're going to see for years to come. The mental health of not just nurses, of all healthcare workers. Our respiratory therapists were in the room with me. And I think that's where I worry a little bit about, down the road, what this has done, not just to me, but to other colleagues that I work with. I mentioned that I can shut it off, or that you build that thick skin. And I think what I noticed after a couple months of caring for the COVID-19 patients is that I was able to do that a little bit to kind of protect myself so that I wasn't crying in the corner in my unit, but I also stopped feeling happy. I stopped enjoying things with my kids, with my family, and I don't think I'm alone in that. And I think that's the hardest thing, that to have to admit that about yourself and what it's done to the mental health of healthcare workers across the country and actually across the world, because we certainly have seen this in Italy and the other countries that were significantly affected with COVID.
Yeah, thank you. I want to hear a little more from Nurse James, but before I go to him, I want to reintroduce Dr. Scantlebury, or not necessarily reintroduce her, but I want to go back to Dr. Scantlebury and address some of the complications leading up to even kidney disease, complications of COVID, because Nurse James actually dealt with a lot of kidney patients who had kidney failure and would have to go through dialysis. And so Dr. Scantlebury, talk about some of the complications of COVID. You have people coming into the ER, you have folks all of a sudden getting ill, right? but there are folks in the hospital at the time already suffering from complications related to other health issues. Can we go into that a bit?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we know that, as you know, Dr. Perry would tell you, those patients who are seen, if they're not having trouble breathing or not low on oxygen, and they're can be really recuperate at home, they're sent home. But we know that you have to realize that it was May 27th of 2020 that we hit here in the United States 100,000 deaths from coronavirus. And, you know, it seems like a small amount, but at that time, we also realized that our ICUs were crowded. We didn't have enough ventilators. And so the most frequent presenting issue for Kathy and those healthcare workers were taking care of these patients who couldn't breathe, who developed pneumonia, who had ARDS. And those were the cases that you had nearly tremendous fatality, as she described, months before a patient actually survived. And we know about the blood clots as was associated, but one of the things that we didn't realize early on, except for when we looked at some of the studies from Italy and other places, where there were various reports that as much as 35% of COVID cases involve the kidneys and acute kidney failure, acute kidney insufficiency, which can be seen at least in some disease, obesity, and are more likely to develop COVID-19 and are therefore more likely, especially within the Black population, more likely to develop acute kidney injury associated with COVID-19. And unfortunately, for people of color, as much as here in one of the New York studies, nearly 25% of patients compared to white patients developed, as far as Black patients, in looking at over 5,000 patients who were hospitalized in New York City, 25% of those developed acute kidney injury because of these underlying health factors. So those are some of the health disparities that we had to deal with, and therefore showed that COVID-19 was affecting people of color with many more severe symptoms than we initially realized. So we have James here, who had to deal with these patients who had kidney injury, and so many of them ended up needing to be dialyzed.
Yeah, James, talk to us about caring for patients with kidney failure, and not initially thought to be a major complication, but having to care for such patients during a crisis. What was that like?
Yeah, being an acute dialysis nurse, I was called most of the time in the middle of the night to go and dialyze this patient. Most of these patients, I'll find that they came to the hospital not having kidney injuries, but after a while, they developed a kidney injury, as Dr. Scantlebury said. And it was very tough because these patients were mostly young, and like before when they were saying that only old people were getting COVID. And I found most of my patients were Black and brown, mostly male, middle-aged. And some of the patients had pre-existing conditions like diabetes, hypertension, asthma, HIV, and obesity. And it was quite tough because these patients were, remember, they were in isolation. So I had to gown up, put on the gowns, the mask, N95. Maybe sometimes before we used to put two masks because we were so afraid of getting the COVID. And I would be locked with them in their room for 4.5 hours to dialyze them, which was very, very tough because of all these PPEs, I couldn't even move or breathe. Mobility was very, very affected too. So it was very, very tough. We normally, like a treatment was normally ordered for 3 hours by the doctors who were very considerate. They ordered treatment between 2 hours and 3 hours, but By the time I get in the patient's room, sanitize, put on my gown, go in, check the patient, assess the patient, set the machines, start the treatment, it will take almost 4.5 to 5 hours, which was very, very tough.
For people who don't know, I explain dialyze, right? Explain, what is that process like? I had an aunt who had to go through dialysis weekly, sometimes twice a week. But explain that entire process and how many patients did you see on a day-to-day?
Okay, dialysis is a process where, in a layman's language, we clean the blood, all those toxins. Like sometimes the electrolytes will be off, sodium will be high, creatinine will be high, potassium we have to clean and put the patient back on their baseline. So we pull blood from the patient's body, run it through our dialysis machine, clean it, and then put back to the patient. It takes almost 3 to 4 hours to do that. So the blood keeps on circulating in the machine, being cleaned, and then goes back to the patient's body. And then the other question you asked was like how many patients I got within a day. Apart from the normal scheduled patient that we normally see in a hospital, we used to have 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 patients for emergency dialysis. So we have to do them fast, and then the other patients who are scheduled will do them last. This made us have very, very long hours. Sometimes we work 16, 17 hours a day, go home, take a quick nap, and then go back in the hospital in the morning, or you'd be called in the middle of the night, because I'm on call most of them, maybe 3 or 4 times a night. And I'll be called about, out of 3 nights a week, I'll be called twice at the middle of the night. So our hours were very, very long.
So long hours, a regular, prior to the pandemic, you would see maybe up to 4 patients. So during COVID, you would see maybe double the number?
Yeah, like in a week, personally, I would do almost 20 or more than 20 patients. That's one staff member, which is a lot. Because in a day, you're supposed to do 2 patients or 2 or 3 at the most. But we're not even doing 4 patients a day. Yeah. So
if you had that many, you weren't with every patient that long. I guess a lot of people had to be called in to work to assist.
yeah, and for that nurse, you have to be with the patient for the whole time of treatment. You can't leave the patient because, as Dr. Scantlebury said, most of them they are very, very, very sick, and you have to keep an eye on them because blood pressure keeps on dropping. You have to manage the blood pressure, make sure that doesn't drop too much, and plus they have a risk of blood clotting. So we kept an eye on all those kind of things and medicate them in between treatments with blood pressure medications.
Wow.
Yeah.
What is it like for you now that we have a vaccination? Are you still working long hours or seeing a lot of patients?
Actually, no, it started getting better since people started getting the vaccination and people started listening to the healthcare experts to put on the mask and isolate or practice distancing. Right now, we are not working those very long hours, although sometimes it picks up. But I can say compared to 2020, it's been better this year. Yeah.
My next question is for all of the panelists, but James, I do want to ask you this. How has the pandemic shaped you?
Well, initially I was very, very fearful, as my colleague said. I was fearful that I was going to infect my family and even possibly die. So I was scared. I can tell you that, and I was full of anxiety. It affected me psychologically, and I was like, most of the time I was isolated. I couldn't go visit my friend. They couldn't come see me because they were scared that I was going to infect them, or I was going to, or vice versa. So this pandemic has made me think twice about life and learn how to appreciate life, because I see it's very, very easy to die, and I cherish friendship and family more than before. Yeah.
It makes you more intentional, right, about your
Yeah, of course.
relationships and
Yeah.
some of the things that you do on a daily basis. Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Perry, how has the pandemic shaped you?
It's definitely made me it's definitely made me appreciate a lot of the little things that bring joy and happiness. Like something as small as being outdoors is, that was the world to me. The reason why I got through the pandemic is because I picked up fishing during the pandemic, because it was the way for me to get out of the house, catch my own food, not have to be around a lot of people, and still, but it made me realize like everything that we have can be just gone within the drop of a dime. And at the end of the day, your relationships matter the most. At the end of the day, if that happens, like, who did you touch? Who, I never want to be the person to say, man, I wish I would have, had that conversation with the person, before they left. Like, I'm definitely now giving a lot more flowers to people while they're here with me. From a psychological standpoint, like, it was stressful having to like intubate patients from a box, or having to like deal with abscesses that were draining, abscesses around my like face where I was wearing an N95 mask for 12 hours out of the day. It's definitely made me slow down and breathe and look around and think about what I'm happy for and thankful for, as opposed to what I'm trying to achieve next. And I think that's what we all needed to some degree. So, there's a silver lining in it all. But that's how that's shaped me.
Yeah, things change inside of you when things change around you, right? And I would say the same. I picked up some hobbies myself, little old school hobbies for folks, the hula hooping, the skating, so doing little things like that. Nurse Kathy, share with us, how has the pandemic shaped you?
I think a lot of what everyone else has said, just to appreciate the things, live in the moment more, and not worry so much about tomorrow and next week. I like to get outside, like Brian said. I like to run and swim and bike, so I've been doing that a lot. And in a way that I didn't expect it to, is I've kind of reevaluated what I want out of my career. And I have dropped, I don't work as much, just because I kind of needed to slow down. It took like I said, it took a toll on a lot of us. And I certainly have many colleagues who've done the same.
Yeah.
Dr. Scantlebury, I want you to jump in as well and answer this question. It seems like, you retired, but you went into full speed, full mode of raising awareness about COVID-19. But share with us, how has this pandemic shaped you?
Thanks. I think for me, being at home and working from home, we were shut down as a transplant service. We weren't allowed to, transplantation was considered not an emergency, except for a few cases. And so initially, with the lack of ventilators and using the OR, we weren't allowed to operate. And so I discovered I love outdoors. I don't like being stuck at home. So fortunately for me, it was an opportunity to discover the hiking trails of Delaware. So I realized living here in Pike Creek that there was so many places I could walk that I didn't even realize that were around. So we actually went out, my husband and my daughter and I, and so we discovered those hiking trails. And that was my relief. I love nature. I like being out there. I don't fish, but I actually love watching those who were fly fishing and along the Brandywine and other creeks. And so it was really awesome for me. But I was on track to retire. I wasn't sure. I'm not the type of person who liked to sit around. I wasn't on the front lines, but I wanted to get involved because the disparities of those who were affected in terms of a Black or Brown community was hard to deal with. The lack of access, even in getting a COVID test. If you can't remember, there was so much difficulty, even with one of our nurses that I worked with who thought she had COVID and she needed a prescription and she needed to go to the medical center. And so just the whole idea of getting in to get a test for someone in the healthcare profession was difficult, regardless. And then you think about those who are living in communities who didn't have private physicians or someone to go to get a prescription. If you're ill, you needed COVID tests. And so I got involved because I saw there was a need to really address the disparities and what can I do in terms of getting our population to understand how do they get tested? How do we get people to the point where they can get diagnosed before they end up dying and dying at home? And I have family in New York, and seeing those makeshift morgues along the streets outside of the Brooklyn hospitals was absolutely disheartening. So that was my goal, is what can I do? How can I get involved? And so being not on the front lines, I decided to do it from second tier. So that was my mission, and I continue to do it as it relates to vaccination also.
How do you manage your self-care, doing all of these things now?
Well, I still try to walk, but now that the weather's out is nice. I love gardening, so I've been exhausting myself in my garden. My husband and I has been rearranging plants, and I've been on the hunt for the best perennials and trying to strategically decide how I'm going to plan my garden and put what where by height. So I'm very obsessed with it, and so I'm out there until the wee hours, until the sun goes down, trying to water and rearrange and just garden in the front and the back. So that's my stress relief.
I'm trying to get there. I'm growing blueberries. And so, yeah, I hope to garden myself, even though I don't have much of a green thumb. What about Nurse Kathy, Nurse James, Dr. Perry? Tell us any tips for some of the audience members, and just want to remind some of our folks who are tuning in this evening to feel free, type in a question. We are here for you this evening. Of course, we want to share stories from the front lines, but if you have a question, don't be shy, type it in, and we'll get right to your question and ask the person that you want to direct your question to. So, Dr. Perry, any self-care tips you want to share?
Self-care tips?
Yeah.
I will say that there's a quiet place for everybody, and finding that quiet place where there's nothing else going on, where you can really have the most mental clarity is so therapeutic. And and like I said, fishing was like that for me, but exercising and different activities, and everyone has to find their own activity where they are in their quiet place. But then, that's, I would say, find a quiet place and lean into more of those activities that give you that peace of mind, that take you away from your stress and take you away from the worries. Is great self-care. I think everyone needs that, even outside of the pandemic. I think everybody needed that.
Nurse Kathy?
I just kind of piggybacking on what Brian said, for self-care, I like to run. I mean, I would go run sometimes 16, 18 miles after I woke up from a particularly bad night shift. And that was my quiet place, as crazy as it sounds to a lot of people. But I do think I'm a big believer in exercise and getting outside. So I think, whatever it is, whatever self-care looks like for you. And I would also say for those of us that were on the front lines, we did hear that buzzword, self-care, resiliency. And I would also suggest that, if you feel that you're not in a good place, to seek professional help as well. Especially, for those people that were on the front lines, we certainly saw a lot of people that did not fare out very well in the pandemic. So I would suggest, for those that are doing the self-care and are not finding that it's helpful, to seek out professional help.
Thank you for even sharing that part, because mental health is very important, and you guys all spoke to that this evening. James, what about you? Any tips?
Yeah, my tips would be like, I urge every one of us, especially people in the front line, take care of yourself first, body and soul. Make sure that you eat well, exercise, have a lasting friendship, connect with your family, connect with your God if you believe you are spiritual, and make sure that you're very as close as possible to your family, because this life is very fragile and very short. Yeah, so for me, I started, like most of the panel said, I started running, and I used to run like maybe 10 miles a day for 3 days a week. And this was partly because I was kind of isolated, and I thought maybe I was having some mental issues, because I didn't want to go near people. I didn't want to get close to my family. So I took out to being outside, being outdoors, running in the park, or just running for a short marathon. Yeah, so the mental aspect is very, very key, especially to those of us who are in the front line.
I think we'll get more questions coming in, but one person did ask, and let me go back to my chat. I actually have a few questions coming in. Sorry about that. So let's start with a question from Karen. Karen wants to know if any of you plan to write about your firsthand experiences for future generations. That's a good one. Thank you, Karen.
I have not, although I do know some nurses that I work with who are thinking of doing that. And I encourage people to do it, because it's, it's good to journal. I think it's good for your mental health. And I think it would be good for future generations, especially a talk like this.
Yeah, anyone else?
For me, I haven't thought about it, but I've been talking to my kids. I have an 18-year-old and 14-year-old. I've been talking to them about my experiences, and my daughter has been writing them down to carry on maybe to the next generation. So that's a good point. Maybe I might think about that. Maybe it sounds like a good plan.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it myself either, but I find myself telling stories all the time about different patients, or so that's a good thought. I probably should write these down for sure.
And may I add that COVID Chronicles, they're really looking for these stories. So
yes,
go to the website and just add them. They'll be added to the history books.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to share with the audience as well. For those of you who are near a computer, obviously because you're online tonight, but near a piece of paper, write down covidchroniclesde.org. Feel free to share your story. All of us have a story to share when it comes to living through this pandemic and having family members who may have been diagnosed with COVID, and even vaccinated for that matter, but please share your stories. We would love to get as many as possible, and also check out a very cool documentary that's on line as well, COVIDchroniclesde.org. We love hearing from the frontline workers, but we would also like to hear from many of you who may have been, well, many of us have been forced to work from home, but just sharing your work from home stories, sharing stories from maybe homeschooling your children. I'm sure you would love to get those all out. And so I want to talk about vaccinations, because this is a part that I'm sure many people will get the questions rolling in. Any reluctance to getting vaccinated? But before I go to our panelists, I want I want a video to play, and it's a really important video to tune into so that we can start this conversation about vaccinations. So let's roll the video. Okay, before we get to the video, I would like to just have some of the doctors talk about, and frontline workers share about their reluctance to get vaccinated. Starting with you, Nurse Kathy, did you have a little concern about the vaccinations?
Actually, I did not. And, I would get asked from literally everybody I came in contact with. As soon as they found out I worked at a COVID ICU, that was the first question, from the grocery worker at the Acme to people I might see at the gym or out on the street even. They would ask me, are you going to get the vaccine? And my response was, yes, I'm going to get it as soon as it's available, because I have never seen anything like this. The acuity, how sick these patients would come into my ICU. And sure, there are side effects with every vaccine, but I know that COVID scares me far more than any of the side effects from the vaccine. And I've been vaccinated, my husband's been vaccinated, and all 4 of my children have been vaccinated. So I'm a huge proponent of everyone getting the vaccine.
Dr. Perry and James, I want to ask you to, any reluctance, especially being Black men, so many people of color, Black and brown, are a little nervous about this vaccination, but what about you guys being people of color?
Yeah, I think that with anything, of course, this new technology, there's, this new disease, and with anything, you arm yourself with the knowledge. And I spent a lot of time on, researching, looking at YouTube videos, looking at like the science behind it, how it worked. And just like we said, like, you're going to take a risk one way or another. You get the vaccine, okay, you might have a cold or some soreness in your arm, but that's a far less gamble than actually contracting COVID to me. But then, I feel like anytime, and we witnessed, something that was, anytime there's something that happens around us that we don't fully grasp or understand, our minds try to do what they can to fill in the blanks. And that's how you get microchip theories and 5G and, oh my gosh, so many different concepts that are just misinformation, because at the root of everything, it's a lack of knowledge, right? And so I had to, arm myself with the knowledge for sure. But it's one perspective. Like, we all, as healthcare workers, we have a completely different perspective. I think from a lot of people, like, we're seeing people die in front of us every day, and that's our life, for an entire year. A shot in the arm is definitely not anywhere near as bad in my eyes as what we saw in 2020. But to someone who might just be cooped up in the house, working at home, who doesn't have a lot of social interaction and wants to get out and go and be around people and wonder why their lives are disrupted, like I can totally, it's just a completely different lens of scope and perspective. But I think that it's definitely a good thing. And even to this day, I'm still, having conversations with some of my friends about, all right, let's talk about this vaccine. One of my good friends who was resistant for a long time just got vaccinated. And it's not even necessarily about, hey, you do this. I think everyone has to make their own choice. But it's just a matter of making sure that everybody is operating with the same set of facts.
Yeah. James, any reluctance? Did you hesitate at all when presented with the opportunity to get vaccinated?
Yeah, for me, when the vaccines came out, I was very, very willing to go and get one. And this was partly because the way I saw those patients suffer in the hospitals, I was like, a shot in the arm, it's the pros, I weighed the pros and the cons of getting the virus. And I was like, I have to get this vaccine. And when I got the vaccine, the same day, luckily there was a nurse who was taking pictures. So I made sure that I sent the pictures to all my friends to see that I was vaccinated. And so most of them, they were like, oh, if James got it, I'll get it too. And I've been talking to them, and most of my friends, I can say that they have gotten the vaccine, except maybe one I was talking to last Sunday in church. He's still in the fence, and he's like, I want to see how you guys will be in a couple months, and then I'll take my shot. Slowly by slowly, he's coming to our side, and I'm sure he'll get it. Mm-hmm. And I've been talking even to patients that I happen to dialyze who have not taken the shots. I urge them to go and take the vaccine because it helps a lot. And actually, my daughter who is 18 years old, she got hers, and I'm planning to take my son who is 13 years old this week to get the shots. Yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you. The best of luck. I'm going to have, I want to go to a video now. Let's roll this video.
Stop. Wait a minute now. We need to talk about this COVID-19 vaccine. Over 400,000 lives lost and more than 25 million positive cases. Mistrust in our community is very real. Even if we weren't there, we remember the Tuskegee experiment and we know about Henrietta Lacks. So when it comes to making the big decision about taking the vaccine, knowledge is power. Let's discuss a few things like, how does our body's immune system work anyway? What is the mRNA vaccine? And how is it different from vaccines like the flu? First, if our immune system is attacked by viruses, it does its best to fight back. Unfortunately, the fight takes days and it can be fierce and intense. While our cells decide what parts of the virus to attack and build up an army for the fight, the virus is replicating, expanding, and trying to take over. The beautiful thing is that once our immune system wins the fight, most of the time it can remember the virus. And if the virus tries to come back, it gets smacked back because our memory cells are ready. Why is the COVID-19 mRNA vaccine different? Traditional vaccines use the real virus, inactivated or weakened, to inject into our bodies. To make the mRNA vaccine, scientists found a protein on the outside of the virus to attack. The M in mRNA stands for messenger. It has a set of instructions for the body. It gets injected and our bodies process the vaccine and get rid of it in a matter of days. but it leaves behind some instructions so that if we're exposed, our bodies remember that it has these instructions and sends a message to our immune cells. Our body then creates a protein that sticks to the spikes that keep the virus from replicating. Our bodies then begin making antibodies to neutralize the invading virus so we don't get sick. Basically, it remembers the enemy to protect us in the future. Now, I will say this. Yes, it's a fact that vaccines can save lives. Also, you cannot get COVID-19 from mRNA vaccines because you never get injected with the virus. Fact, when you take the vaccine, you may have fatigue, joint pain, headache, a fever for up to 2 days, and muscle pain in the arm where you took the shot, but it's not because you have COVID-19. And lastly, there is a possibility that you can still get and transmit the disease if you receive the vaccine, so you should still wear a mask as recommended by the CDC. Now that you have more facts, aren't you glad we had this talk?
One of my favorite videos, to be exact, actually, when talking about the vaccination. I want to take this time and turn things over to Dr. Scantlebury, who will talk about the reluctance to get vaccinated. We'll talk about underserved communities and herd immunity as well. Dr. Velma Scantlebury.
Well, thank you so much. And we have to tackle the CDC's report recently that says, those who are vaccinated are not likely to transmit the disease, so they can shed their mask. So that's another topic. But we really need to achieve, we talked about achieving herd immunity, and that's really about getting 70 to 85% of our population immune to the virus, hopefully by vaccination or either by previous infection. And so when we look at the data here in Delaware, we have 75% of our Delawareans over the age of 65 are vaccinated because we started with that age group very early on. But when we look at the rest of the population, we're a little bit under 40% or just about 40%. When we look at the white population and the Asian population, they really have good numbers, but only 28% of our Black community have received vaccines and about 29% of the Hispanics. So we have work to do. And so we need to tackle right now the reluctance to get vaccinated. And, we heard about the distrust that existed for generations, and we still continue to have that vaccine hesitancy, despite the fact that we have Black and brown people at the table with this vaccine rollout. And so the history is there, and we are going to face it and realize that there's that element of distrust. But we've now had this vaccine out for quite a few months. And granted, when we looked at a survey back in January, December to January, when it was looked in questions to population of African Americans, only about 20% were in favor of getting vaccinated. And that all sparked conversations about how can we get more Black and brown people to agree to vaccination. So now we find that by the beginning of April, that number increased about 55%. So we are making roads in terms of getting our people of color vaccinated, but we certainly need to have much more. We still need to do much more because we still have about a third of the people of our population who just don't want to get vaccinated. And whether is that they still feel that there's not enough information about it, they are worried about the long-term side effects. But we heard from some of our panelists that this is a shot of hope. You have to consider the pros and cons of getting COVID and dying from COVID. And we heard from our experienced panelists in the healthcare field what it is to really deal with this disease and the suffering and the death that we saw back then. Granted, it's much less, but our communities need to think about, and what we're doing here in Delaware is actually targeting specific regions of our aspects of Delaware who are still low on vaccination. So whether it's by using mobile units, going pop-up vaccination sites. We were out in Wilmington last Saturday, and Lieutenant Governor Bethany Long was we were walking around neighborhoods. She was knocking on doors, just getting people to come out to be vaccinated. So those things are very important for us to target or specifically target our areas that are low in vaccination rates so that we can get to herd immunity.
I want to go to a question that we have from an audience member, and I wanted to hold this. The question is, how much should we fear a fall resurgence of COVID-19? Once vaccinated, will our immunity last for another year?
Well, we certainly are beginning to learn more about this virus and the immunity from vaccines. We also, we know that when people get COVID, they hold on to some immunity, some do not, which is why we're saying, even if you had a COVID, like Kathy, you still need to be vaccinated because we're not sure your immunity would last. But we know that with the virus, we will have different variants and mutants from time to time. We now know that what is around currently, even here in Delaware at this point, whether it's the South African or the UK variant, that's not what was around when I got vaccinated in December. So as as this virus changes and mutates, so the more people get infected, the more it mutates. We don't know as we get into the fall what will happen. Hopefully, we'll be able to get more people vaccinated during the summer, and if that occurs, we will have less ability to have this virus mutate. But as people travel and go to other countries and let the guard down, we also run the possibility as we get into the fall to see a whole new set of variants for this virus. Will the immunity last? Only by looking at studies and research for those who have gotten vaccinated and checking the antibody status, the more we'll learn about the persistence of our immunity at a year. So this is an ongoing, this is a new experiment, not experiment, this is a new virus for us. And every time we tabulate our patients, we learn more and more about them. For me as a transplant surgeon, I'm beginning to learn that our transplant patients are not having the same level of immunity, even with 2 doses of the vaccine. So they have to be in another level of cautiousness, because when you're saying you get both your shots and you're now immune, they're not immune. Not even 50% of them are beginning to hold on to the immunity even after 2 doses. So we still have to be conscious of the kids who are under 12 years old who will not be able to get vaccinated and still may be able to get infected. And we have to be worried about those who are HIV or transplant patients or have chronic illnesses who may still be at risk for getting COVID.
Why aren't kids, can you go into a little bit more detail about why some kids or a certain age range do not have to be vaccinated?
Well, it's not like they don't have to be vaccinated. The trials were done by Pfizer particularly, and I think Moderna is also doing some more trials, but you have to go through for the FDA to get emergency use authorization. You have to have studies done to show that the virus doesn't cause significant consequences to those who are getting the vaccine. So Pfizer did their studies on 12 to 15-year-olds and were able to show that within those group of kids who entered the trial, those who didn't get the vaccine, a certain percentage of those got COVID, and those who got the vaccine, none of them got COVID. So we're able to show that getting the vaccine for 12 to 15 was effective and protect our young people. And so to go back on their current studies, looking at age 5+ forward. And so once those studies be able to show to the FDA that there were no detrimental effects to those young people, then they will be approved for that age group. So, but you do need to go through the phase studies as recommended by the FDA before we can actually say that it's safe to be able to vaccinate our kids. And so parents have those concerns. So you want to look at the phase 3 studies and make sure that the outcomes were positive, no deaths, no major adverse events to our young people.
Anything else you want to add about underserved communities? Are we still seeing some communities being neglected?
Well, we still see many communities who are still hesitant as we roll out and have many more pop-up vaccine sites. There are now more vaccine and more vaccine sites available, but we're still seeing the turnout is not as great. It may be 10, it may be 15, it may be 20 as opposed to 100 and 200, what we were expecting. But that's still 15 more people that are vaccinated. And so as we go door to door or we talk to many people, they're still, no, not for me. It's not for me. There are those who see the signs and decide and are driving by and decide, well, why not? It's convenient. I'm not working. I can't be there tomorrow. And so it's convenient for them. And so they show up. So we do have to pound the pavement in those areas. We may have to be strategic in terms of making sure we are at the right place at the right time, because we've done churches, we've done community centers. And so it's about trying to figure out maybe the mobile units to be able to get those people in neighborhoods. We know that for some, those who are immigrants are in fear of giving out their information. So we want to make sure that we're not asking for all the pertinent information and for them to understand that they can get vaccinated without worrying about the fact that they're going to be reported or deported.
Do you find that people are a little hesitant because of the 2 shots? Moderna and Pfizer offered 2 shots. It's a 2-shot deal.
There is a population of patients who are so afraid of needles. When they finally get down to it, they're willing to take out 1 shot. And I've had several patients, both men and women, who, despite the issues surrounding the Johnson & Johnson, are still willing to get that because they do not want to come back for a second dose. And so when we look at persons who were vaccinated with 1 dose here in Delaware, excuse me, we have nearly 34,000 people got Johnson & Johnson vaccine here in Delaware because they just wanted that 1 dose, that 1 shot deal. And so it's important for many people who just say, I don't want to come back. I'll take my chances and get the dose. So they got the dose and at least they're protected. And despite what vaccine you get, remember, they all keep you from dying of COVID or being hospitalized tremendously. So you may get COVID, it's not 100%, but hopefully the severity is minimized and that you may have some symptoms, but not severe enough to be hospitalized in an ICU.
I do have one more question for you before we go back to the panelists. Do you recommend that people get their flu shot in addition to the COVID vaccine?
Well, for any vaccines that related to COVID, one of the things that we have to ask our patients when you get in a COVID vaccine is, have they had any vaccinations within 2 weeks? So generally, we want to be able to spread those vaccinations apart from each other, so they can still get the flu shot, just not within 2 weeks of their COVID shot.
Okay, and so going back to our panelists, actually, you know what, before I even do that, I want to add that Delawareans should continue to follow the CDC guidelines, but there will be some things lifted effective tomorrow. And I want to share a website for those of you who are still interested or maybe interested in getting the vaccination or getting vaccinated rather. But the website is de.gov/getmyvaccine. Also, for those of you who have been vaccinated, again, Dr. Scantlebury actually addressed this about the mask. There will still be a mask requirement indoors and outdoors, but some are saying from the CDC and even from local officials that when it comes to your mask, visitors do not have to wear face coverings outside, and that will be lifted tomorrow. Again, residents should follow the CDC guidance. Fully vaccinated people can start wearing a mask again in most indoor places, but definitely outdoor places unless it's crowded. Now, going back to our panelists, I want to ask you guys, is there a take-home message? Do any of you have a take-home message for the audience? Should I call on names? Dr. Perry? Do you have a take-home message for the audience?
Cherish the day. Carpe diem. Smell the flowers. Be safe. Consider other people. Take care of yourself. Short and sweet.
Thank you. Nurse James, what about you? What's your take-home message?
My take-home message for the whole community. Let me start with my fellow first responders. It's despite being having a very, very tough year, 2020, I'll just tell them, keep on fighting. We're doing a good job, and keep on praying for our patients and their families. And remember those people who died because of the COVID. And we know most of them died not because of their own fault, because of carelessness from other people who made wrong decisions. And for us, people in the front line, despite being impacted by the COVID, I know we had a lot of exhaustion, burnout, physical discomfort, anxiety, fear, emotional distress. But let's keep hope and let's cherish each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Kathy, what's your take-home message?
I think my take-home message would be similar to what everybody else has been saying, to kind of cherish the moment, take care of yourself, and to all the frontline workers out there, to take care of yourself and to be safe. This was a very, very scary time for all of us.
Thank you. I want to take this opportunity to plug COVID Chronicles, de.org again for the Delaware Historical Society. I'm just going to read a little excerpt. It says, your stories and your experiences can serve as an original source of information about the unprecedented events that are evolving with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and response. And so documenting and submitting your firsthand accounts and photos, of course, for those of you who are camera shy, will help future students, teachers, and researchers analyze and interpret the complexity of this moment. Whether you are on the front lines of the pandemic, doing your part to practice social distancing, or getting creative while sheltering in place, the Delaware Historical Society wants to hear from you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Delaware Historical Society, for all that you're doing. I also want to say thank you to my panelists. Thank you so much, Kathy, Dr. Perry, James, Dr. Velma Scantlebury, who decided to put this together as well, helping the Delaware Historical Society. These stories are important, and I'm glad you guys are all doing well and decided to be a part of this platform to raise more awareness. Any last words from you, Dr. Velma Scantlebury?
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this opportunity to highlight our own Delawarean frontline workers and to have them share their story, because we need to have our own stories in our history books of how they dealt with this crisis, this pandemic of 2020, a year we'll never forget for many reasons. And now in 2021, we're seeing some relief. I mean, I remember getting my COVID vaccine and feeling like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and that now I'm now equipped, and hopefully by the second dose, I felt rejuvenated, that I can at least have that sense of perhaps I'm not going to die from COVID. I'm not going to be a long hauler and have these disabilities that so many patients, so many people still are suffering from long-term consequences of this disease. And we are now being able to breathe a sigh of relief. But for me, I still need to be cautious. I'm over that 65 plus, and I worry about those around me. And so it's not just about us, it's about the people, our loved ones, our friends, staying safe, worry about our family. I've learned to pray more this past year than ever before. because God has blessed all of us with the ability to help others and to continue to do his good work. And so for me, I hope that you guys, everyone here found this webinar extraordinarily and phenomenal. And I thank you for being with us and coming forward, Kathy, Brian, and James, for participating in this opportunity to talk about what has happened here in Delaware. And we look forward to even more to come. So thank you, Nichelle.
Oh, thank you. I want to also go to one other thing. I want to remind all of you, if you have any questions about COVID Chronicles, please shoot an email, your questions, anything that you have to ask Delaware Historical Society, shoot the questions to covidchroniclesde@gmail.com. Now, these stories must be Delaware focused. That's one of the few limitations, but shoot your emails and your questions to covidchroniclesde@gmail.com. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed being online with all of you this evening. I want to turn things over to our wonderful Dr. Stephanie Lampkin or Melva Ware, if you want to add something to our outgoing message, feel free.
Well, thank you, Nichelle, and all of our panelists. I just want to give a round of applause for those in the audience who I know are clapping, but we may not hear. Phenomenal presentations, and I want to thank you for your just vulnerability and openness in sharing your stories with us. This has really been an honor and a great opportunity. And with this recording, we'll be able to ensure that we can share this with others who couldn't join us tonight or years from now. So this is a wonderful opportunity to engage with you. And I want to thank you all again for joining us this evening. Please do visit our website, dehistory.org, for more upcoming events, as well as our History Makers Award event, which will be happening in October, and you will all receive information via email along with an evaluation for this program to keep you updated on that event. So thank you all again, and have a wonderful evening.